Okay, we've got our circles with SVG defined in straight up HTML. The next step here is I'd like to introduce D3, data-driven documents. We're going to pull it in using a CDN, Content Distribution Network, and then write some JavaScript that will create these circles inside of this SVG. So I'll start by forking this example because I want to keep that one around. And I'll call it circles with D3. And then I'll just try this AI editing and say, render these same circles, but with D3. Wow, I think that actually worked. That actually worked. Let's see the code that it came up with. Okay, so the SVG is still defined here in the HTML, but now it's empty. There's nothing there. And then it's pulling in the D3 library from d3js.org. And that is a place where it's hosted, but I don't know. I would prefer to pull it in from some place that just feels a little more reliable, like Unpackage or JSDeliver. We can change that in a bit. And then we have this script tag where src is script.js. And let's see script.js. Okay, circles data. I love this. I love this. This is brilliant. This is exactly what I would have done. And so here we have a JavaScript array being assigned to a variable called circles data. That's what this square brackets represents. It's an array, a list of things, a list of items. And each of these items is an object. So in JavaScript, objects are denoted with these curly braces. And then each object has a property called CX, CY, and R. And these are numbers, floating point numbers. And then fill, which is a string. And so what we're doing here is mimicking the structure of the SVG, but inside of JavaScript. And by the way, the data structure that most commonly is used to represent data, specifically tabular data, with D3 is exactly this. It's an array of objects. Okay, so first we define the data, and then there's a function here called render circles. But before we look at that, let's see how it's invoked. So first of all, it says here d3.select SVG. Now, where does D3 come from? Well, because of the way that this is set up, it's pulled in here, the script tag. And when this is evaluated, it creates what's called a global variable or a browser global called D3. It's assigned to window.d3 or just D3. Now, this is kind of the old school way of doing it, and I'm going to change this around, but that's just how it's working now. And then d3.select is the main DOM manipulation function from D3 that lets you use selectors like in CSS to select DOM elements on the screen. So what this does is it creates a D3 selection that contains our existing SVG element. And keep in mind that SVG is defined here in HTML. So the SVG exists before the JavaScript even runs, and it just gets selected or picked up on here. And then it calls this function render circles, where the first argument is SVG, our selection that contains a single element. And then the second argument is circles data. And then here's the function definition that accepts two arguments, the selection and then the data. So here is the famous D3 data join. This is the D3 incantation that you'll see everywhere with D3. And what this does is it makes sure to synchronize the DOM with the data array. So here it is, selection.select all circle dot data dot join circle. So to break this down, first, it will select all of the existing circle elements. And the first time this is called there are none. So it comes back empty. And then the dot data call creates a data join where it's a unified internal structure that knows about the data array, and it also knows about the DOM elements that currently exist. And then the dot join will create new circle elements for each data element for which there's not already a circle present. And because this runs only once, it's a very simple case. But the D3 data join is designed so that it can be run multiple times to keep the DOM in sync with the data as the data could potentially change over time. And this is what's called idempotent rendering. It means no matter how many times this function gets called, it will result in the same DOM. And you need to be careful because when the way that we're doing this, it's going to rely on unidirectional data flow, which we'll cover in depth later. But the whole setup there assumes that the rendering function, this render circles function, for example, could be run multiple times as the state changes as you interact. So anyway, what this does here is it just creates the circle elements. They don't have any properties yet. And then all of these .attr calls, they set the attributes on the circle elements. And when you define it as a function, this function gets invoked for each and every data element, each and every item in the data array. And by convention, we just call it D. That's just a naming convention within the D3 community. And each one of these objects, so consider this object here, the first time those functions are called, the value of D will be this object here. So then we can say D.cx, which will extract this value out. And this is the so-called fat arrow syntax, which has what's called an implicit return. So it implicitly returns this last statement here. And so the effect of this function as it extracts the CX values out of those objects, and then when it gets returned, it gets assigned to the CX attributes of the DOM elements. And this happens for each and every one of our data items because we're calling this .attr on the data join or the selection, the D3 selection that has knowledge of the DOM elements and the data elements. And so once you grok this pattern, it's pretty simple to see that it's just applied to these various different attributes. And again, when we right-click and say inspect, we can see that the structure of the DOM is exactly the way it was before when this was defined directly in HTML. But now it's just driven by JavaScript. See, this gets populated at runtime when the JavaScript runs. And this is called DOM manipulation because it goes in there and it changes around the DOM at runtime. So that's it. This is our first circles with D3 example. That's sort of the essence of how D3 works. This is straight out of AI though, and it's not using the exact patterns that I personally prefer. So that's what I'm going to do next is just clean this up a little. But yeah, this is basically your introduction to D3.